Jake Thompson knelt beside the fallen log, carefully positioning the wire snare between two pine trees. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly around him, painted in the golden colors of late evening. He had been living off the land for 3 weeks now, testing new survival techniques for his upcoming training course. At 42 years old, Jake moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent half his life learning to survive in places where most people would die. The trap was simple, but effective. Small game would follow this path to the creek below, and by morning he would have fresh meat for breakfast. Jake stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, when something made him freeze. 20 years of military training had sharpened his senses beyond normal human limits. Something was wrong with the forest. The usual evening sounds of birds and insects had stopped completely. Above the tree line, a pale blue glow began to spread across the sky. Jake looked up, squinting against a strange light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The light grew brighter, casting weird shadows through the pine branches. His military experience told him this was not natural weather. This was not the northern lights. This was something else entirely. The blue glow suddenly focused into a beam that struck the ground 20 feet away from him. Jake dropped to one knee, reaching for the survival knife on his belt. His heart rate stayed steady, despite the impossible sight before him. In the Army Rangers, he had learned to stay calm, no matter what happened. Fear could kill you faster than any enemy. The beam expanded outward like a searchlight, sweeping across the forest floor. When it touched the trees, the bark began to glow with the same blue energy. When it reached a family of deer drinking at the creek, the animals simply vanished into particles of light that rose up into the sky. Jake realized he was looking at some kind of advanced technology that could break down matter and transport it elsewhere. He turned to run, but the beam moved faster than any human could. The blue light washed over him like warm water, and Jake felt a strange tingling sensation spread through his body. His vision blurred, but his mind stayed sharp. As consciousness began to fade, he forced himself to memorize everything he could see and hear. The sound was a low humming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The light had a metallic taste in the air. Somewhere above, he could hear mechanical sounds like engines or generators. Jake felt his body dissolving, but his awareness remained intact for several more seconds. This was clearly some form of teleportation technology. Someone or something had targeted him specifically. As a former ranger, Jake had been briefed on theoretical scenarios involving contact with unknown forces. The first rule was always the same: gather intelligence before taking action. When the tingling stopped, Jake found himself lying on a cold metal surface. He kept his eyes closed and his breathing steady, pretending to be unconscious while his other senses mapped his new environment. The air smelled sterile and clean, with a slight chemical odor he did not recognize. The surface beneath him was smooth metal, probably some kind of examining table. He could hear footsteps nearby, but they sounded different from human footsteps. Lighter, more careful. Two voices spoke in a language he had never heard before. The sounds were higher pitched than human voices, with clicking noises mixed in between words. Jake focused on memorizing the rhythm and tone of their speech. Learning enemy languages had been part of his military training. Even if he could not understand the words yet, he could begin to identify patterns in emotional content. The footsteps moved around him in a circle. Jake sensed that he was being examined like a specimen in a laboratory. Something cold and metallic touched his forehead, then moved down to his chest and arms. Scanning equipment of some kind, Jake controlled his breathing and heart rate, maintaining the appearance of unconsciousness while the examination continued. One of the voices spoke again, and Jake caught what sounded like satisfaction or approval in the tone. He was apparently meeting their expectations for whatever they had planned. The scanning device moved away, and the footsteps retreated to a distance of about 10 feet. Jake could hear what sounded like electronic equipment being operated, along with more conversation in the alien language. Through his closed eyelids, Jake could see bright lights above him. The temperature was cooler than the Montana forest, probably around 60 degrees. The air circulation system created a very slight breeze from his left side. There were no natural sounds at all, which meant he was either underground or inside some kind of vehicle. Given the technology he had witnessed during his capture, Jake suspected he was aboard a spacecraft. After several minutes, the examination seemed to be complete. Jake heard the aliens moving around the room, operating equipment, and having what sounded like a technical discussion. Based on their relaxed tone, they clearly considered him harmless. This was their first mistake. Jake had survived in combat zones precisely because enemies underestimated him. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man, but his military training had turned him into something much more dangerous. The footsteps approached again, and Jake felt himself being lifted by some kind of energy field. His body rose into the air without being touched, then moved smoothly across the room. He kept his muscles relaxed and his breathing steady, but internally he was mapping every detail of the movement. The room was approximately 30 feet long, based on the time it took to cross it. He was carried through what felt like a doorway, then down a corridor that echoed differently from the examination room. Jake was finally placed on another surface, this one softer than the metal table. When the energy field released him, he allowed his body to settle naturally as if he were still unconscious. The aliens spoke briefly, then he heard their footsteps moving away. A door closed with a soft mechanical sound, and Jake was alone. Then did he open his eyes to see exactly where his captors had brought him, and begin planning his next move. Jake opened his eyes slowly, letting his vision adjust to the harsh white light that filled the small room. His head felt clear, despite whatever they had done to him during transport. Years of military training had taught him to recover quickly from unconsciousness, whether from injury or drugs. He remained perfectly still on the thin mat where they had placed him, using only his eyes to examine his new surroundings. The cell was a perfect cube, maybe 12 feet on each side. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made of the same smooth, white material that seemed to glow with its own light. There were no visible seams or joints anywhere, as if the entire space had been carved from a single piece of stone. Jake had been in military detention before, and he knew that good prison design eliminated anything prisoners could use as tools or weapons. 3 other beings shared the space with him. The closest was definitely not human. It stood about 7 feet tall with green scaly skin and a long tail that swept slowly back and forth across the floor. Its head was elongated like a crocodile, but it walked upright on 2 powerful legs. Yellow eyes with vertical pupils watched Jake carefully as he sat up. The creature wore no clothing, but Jake could see old scars across its chest and arms. This was a warrior from somewhere else in the galaxy. The second captive crouched in the far corner, and Jake had to look twice to understand what he was seeing. It appeared to be made of living crystal, with a body structure similar to a large spider. 8 thin legs supported a central mass that sparkled with internal light. When it moved, Jake could hear tiny musical sounds like wind chimes. The creature's surface reflected the white walls and complex patterns that hurt to look at. Directly, the third being was the strangest of all. It looked like a tree that had learned to walk. Thick brown bark covered a humanoid shape about 8 feet tall, instead of hair. Small branches grew from its head with leaves that rustled softly, even though there was no wind in the cell. Its arms were long and ended in finger-like twigs. When it breathed, Jake could see the bark expanding and contracting like human skin. Beyond the 3 aliens, Jake saw their captors for the first time. 2 pale humanoid figures stood just outside the cell, separated from the prisoners by what appeared to be empty air. But Jake could see a faint shimmer in the space between them, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Some kind of energy. Barrier held them all inside. The guards were thin and tall, probably 6.5 feet in height, but weighing no more than a human teenager. Their skin was pure white, without any hair anywhere on their bodies. Most striking were their heads, which were much larger than human heads, and completely bald. Their eyes were solid black with no visible pupils, and their faces showed no expression at all. They wore simple gray uniforms, with devices attached to their left wrists that blinked with small lights. One of the guards spoke in that same clicking language Jake had heard during his examination. The voice was higher than a human voice, and sounded mechanical, as if it came from a machine instead of a living throat. The second guard responded with similar sounds, and Jake listened carefully to memorize the rhythm and tone of their speech. Jake sat up slowly, making no sudden movements that might alarm his captors. He had learned in prisoner of war training that the first few minutes were crucial for establishing his status. If he showed fear or panic, they would treat him as a helpless victim. If he showed too much aggression, they might decide he was too dangerous to keep alive. Jake needed to appear calm but not threatening. The energy barrier flickered for just a moment, lasting less than a second before returning to full strength. Jake counted silently in his head, watching for the pattern. 35 seconds later, it flickered again. Then 37 seconds after that. The timing was not perfectly regular, which meant it was probably tied to some kind of power cycling system rather than a deliberate security feature. Jake began examining every detail of the cell systematically. The white material of the walls felt smooth but not slippery when he touched it. There was a slight texture, like fine sandpaper. The floor had a small drain in one corner, probably for cleaning purposes. The air moved in a steady current from an opening near the ceiling on his left side, then exited through a similar opening on the right wall. The temperature was comfortable, around 70 degrees. Most importantly, Jake studied the behavior of his guards. They stood with perfect posture, but shifted their weight frequently, suggesting they were not used to long periods of standing watch. They looked at the prisoners with curiosity rather than fear or caution. Their conversation seemed relaxed and casual. Everything about their body language suggested they had never dealt with prisoners who might fight back. The crystalline spider creature moved closer to Jake, making those musical sounds with each step. It stopped about 3 feet away and made a series of different tones, clearly trying to communicate. Jake nodded slowly and pointed to himself, then said Jake in a quiet voice. The creature tilted its central mass, then made a sound that might have been an attempt to repeat his name. The lizard being watched this exchange with obvious intelligence. It approached carefully and touched its own chest, then made a sound like Keth. Jake repeated the name back, and the creature showed what might have been approval by bobbing its head up and down. The tree being rustled, its leaves softly but remained in its corner. One of the guards noticed the interaction and spoke to his companion. Both aliens looked more interested now, as if watching animals perform tricks. Jake filed this reaction away in his memory. The guards saw them as simple creatures, not intelligent beings capable of planning or cooperation. This was their second mistake. Jake settled back against the wall and continued his observation, counting seconds between barrier flickers and memorizing every detail of the guard rotation, equipment, and procedures. Escape would require perfect timing and complete information about his environment. His real education was just beginning. Jake had been in the White Cube for 6 feeding cycles when he first saw Dr. Cora. She was different from the guards, wearing a long white coat over her gray uniform and carrying a tablet device that she constantly touched with her thin fingers. Her oversized head was marked with strange blue symbols that seemed to shift and change as Jake watched. She stood outside the energy barrier for several minutes, studying each prisoner like they were insects in a glass box. The feeding routine happened twice during each light cycle. Guards would deactivate the barrier for exactly 90 seconds, while a mechanical arm extended from the wall to place food containers on the floor. Jake had timed it precisely, using his military training and observation. The guards never entered the cell themselves, and they always stood at least 10 feet back from the barrier opening. Their body language showed complete confidence that the prisoners posed no threat. The food came in small gray blocks that tasted like cardboard but provided adequate nutrition. The containers were made of a flexible material, similar to plastic, but lighter and stronger. Jake ate slowly during each meal, carefully examining every aspect of the container, while appearing to focus only on the food itself. The bottom had a small ridge around the edge that could be broken off with enough pressure. The sides could be bent and shaped without breaking. Most importantly, the material became sharp when torn in the right direction. Dr. Cora began visiting their cell more frequently. After the 3rd cycle, she would stand outside the barrier with 2 guards, speaking in their clicking language while pointing at different prisoners. Jake noticed that she seemed particularly interested in how each species reacted to captivity. The lizard creature, who Jake had learned was called Keth, spent most of his time pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The crystalline being, whose musical name Jake could not pronounce, sat motionless for hours at a time. The tree creature swayed gently, as if moved by wind that only it could feel. Jake deliberately chose a different behavior pattern. He sat quietly, in one corner of the cell, appearing calm and resigned to his situation. He ate when food was provided, drank water from the small dispenser in the wall, and slept at regular intervals. To Dr. Cora and her team, he probably looked like the most docile prisoner they had ever captured. This was exactly what Jake wanted them to think. During the 7th cycle, Dr. Cora brought additional equipment to observe the prisoners. Jake watched her set up a device that projected holographic images into the air above her tablet. The images showed detailed scans of each prisoner's body, with text in the alien language scrolling beside them. Jake could see his own internal organs displayed in 3 dimensions, along with brain activity patterns and other biological data. Dr. Cora spoke to her assistants while pointing at the scan of Jake's brain. Her tone suggested surprise or confusion. Jake realized that his military training in stress management and emotional control was probably creating unusual readings on their equipment. Most prisoners would show high levels of fear, anxiety, and desperation. Jake's brain patterns likely appeared abnormally calm for someone in his situation. One of the guards asked Dr. Cora a question, and her response included a word that Jake had heard several times before. He was beginning to recognize certain sounds in their language, particularly words related to the prisoners and their behavior. This particular word seemed to mean something like specimen or subject. Dr. Cora was treating them exactly like laboratory animals being studied for scientific research. Jake used mealtimes to gather intelligence about his captor's physical capabilities. When the mechanical feeding arm extended into the cell, he could observe the guards' reactions to potential threats. Once, Keth moved quickly toward the opening, and both guards stepped backward immediately. Their fear response was obvious even though they remained outside the range of any possible attack. These aliens had never evolved as predators or warriors. They were physically weak and completely dependent on their technology for protection. The loose floor panel that Jake had discovered during his 2nd day became his most valuable resource. It was located near the drain in the corner, where the white material had apparently been damaged by moisture over time. The panel was only about 6 inches square, but it could be lifted slightly to reveal the metal framework underneath the white surface. Jake worked on loosening it further by applying pressure during his exercise periods, when natural movement would hide his activities. The fabric from Jake's clothing provided additional materials for his growing collection. The cotton shirt he had been wearing during his capture could be torn into strips without making noise. The threads could be separated and braided into strong cordage. Even his shoelaces had potential as binding material or strangling weapons. Jake removed these items, piece by piece, over several cycles, working only when the guards were distracted or absent. Dr. Cora's visits became more frequent and lasted longer each time. She began bringing different types of scanning equipment and even attempted to project images directly into the cell to test the prisoner's reactions. Jake responded to these tests exactly as he calculated would seem normal for a confused and frightened human. He showed appropriate surprise at the holographic images, backed away from loud sounds, and appeared startled by sudden movements. Meanwhile, Jake continued his detailed study of the guard rotation and procedures. The same 2 guards worked during what he had determined was the day shift, while different guards took over during the night period. The day guards were more talkative and relaxed. The night guards were more alert, but also more predictable in their movements. Both shifts followed identical procedures for feeding and observation, suggesting that the Vorthok relied heavily on routine and protocol. By the 10th cycle, Jake had accumulated a small but useful collection of materials hidden in various locations around the cell. The loose floor panel could serve as a lever or club. Strips of fabric became cordage or restraints. Food containers provided cutting edges and projectiles. Even the water dispenser had loose parts that could be removed with sufficient force. Jake shared none of this information with his fellow prisoners yet. He needed to understand their capabilities and loyalties before revealing his plans. But he was already beginning to formulate a strategy that would take advantage of everything he had learned about Vorthok psychology, technology, and weaknesses. The aliens thought they were studying primitive creatures. Jake was studying them right back, and his analysis suggested they had made a serious error in judgment about their latest specimen. The new cell had no windows and no other prisoners. Jake sat alone on the metal floor, surrounded by walls that hummed with electrical energy. Dr. Cora visited him 3 times each day now, always accompanied by different guards who watched him like he might explode at any moment. The fear in their movements told Jake that his attack on Captain Nex had created exactly the psychological impact he had intended. Dr. Cora brought new testing equipment each time she came. Jake recognized some devices as brain scanners similar to human medical equipment, but others were completely alien in design. She would set up her instruments outside the cell and project energy beams through the walls to examine his neural activity. Jake could feel the beams like warm pressure against his skull, but he showed no reaction that might help her understand what was happening. The first major test came on his 3rd day in the isolation cell. Dr. Cora activated a device that filled Jake's mind with images of his worst memories from military service. She was trying to trigger a fear response that her equipment could measure and analyze. Jake saw his fallen comrades, explosions from roadside bombs, and moments when he had nearly died in combat. The images were incredibly realistic, as if he was experiencing those events again. But Jake had learned to control his emotional responses. During years of survival training, he allowed his mind to acknowledge the memories without letting them create panic or terror. Instead of fighting the images, he observed them with the same calm attention he gave to everything else in his environment. His heart rate stayed steady, his brain activity remained controlled, and his body showed no signs of the distress that Dr. Cora was expecting to measure. Dr. Cora spoke to her assistants in frustrated tones. Jake was beginning to understand more of their language each day, and he could tell that his lack of reaction was confusing them greatly. They increased the intensity of the mental images, showing him scenes of torture and death that would have broken most people. Jake simply closed his eyes and used breathing techniques to maintain his inner calm. The second test involved direct attempts to control his thoughts. Dr. Cora used a different device that sent electrical impulses into Jake's brain, trying to force him to obey simple commands. The sensation was like having someone else's voice speaking inside his head, telling him to stand up, sit down, or move to different parts of the cell. Jake could feel the alien technology trying to override his own will. This was where his psychological operations training became most valuable. Jake had learned techniques for resisting interrogation and mental manipulation during his military career. He knew how to compartmentalize his thoughts, how to create mental barriers against outside influence, and how to maintain his core identity, even under extreme pressure. When the alien device told him to stand, Jake would count to 30 in his head before responding. When it commanded him to move, he would deliberately go to the wrong location, to Dr. Cora. This appeared to be partial resistance to her control methods. She did not realize that Jake was choosing exactly when and how to respond to create the impression that her equipment was malfunctioning. Each carefully calculated action made her doubt the effectiveness of her own technology. Jake also began displaying behaviors that would seem random to his captors, but were actually designed to gather specific information. During one test, he pretended to have a seizure when certain brain frequencies were used. This forced Dr. Cora to bring in medical equipment and additional personnel, allowing Jake to observe their emergency procedures and medical knowledge. He learned that the Vorthok had very little experience treating physical trauma or dealing with biological crises. Another time, Jake acted as if the mental control device was working too well, pretending to enter a trance state where he would only respond to direct questions. Dr. Cora became excited by this apparent breakthrough and began asking him detailed questions about human psychology and behavior. Jake answered truthfully about some things, while providing completely false information about others, carefully mixing truth and lies to create maximum confusion. Through these conversations, Jake learned crucial details about Vorthok society and their research mission. They were part of a scientific expedition studying what they called primitive species across the galaxy. Their goal was to catalog different forms of intelligence and determine which species might be useful for various purposes. Some captives were kept for breeding programs, others for manual labor, and still others for continued experimentation. Most importantly, Jake discovered that the Vorthok had never encountered organized resistance from their specimens. Every species they had studied showed predictable responses to captivity, fear, depression, desperate escape attempts, or simple resignation. They had no protocols for dealing with a prisoner who could manipulate his own biological responses and turn their testing procedures into opportunities for intelligence gathering. Dr. Cora began spending longer periods studying Jake's test results, often bringing other scientists to observe her work. Jake could understand enough of their language now to follow their discussions about his unusual brain patterns. They described his neural activity as impossible, according to their understanding of biological intelligence. His ability to control fear, pain, and emotional responses seemed supernatural to them. Commander Vex visited the laboratory several times to observe Jake's testing personally. Jake could tell from the body language and tone of voice that there were disagreements among the senior staff about what to do with him. Some wanted to continue the experiments to understand his abilities. Others argued that he was too dangerous to keep aboard their ship and should be eliminated immediately. Jake used these visits to demonstrate different aspects of his psychological control. When Commander Vex was present, Jake would sometimes appear completely broken and defeated, slumping against the wall and showing no reaction to any stimuli. Other times, he would display controlled aggression, staring directly at the commander with an intensity that made the alien step backward, involuntarily. Each performance was carefully calculated to create specific impressions. Jake wanted them to see him as unpredictable and potentially dangerous, but also as a valuable research subject that they could not afford to lose. This internal conflict would prevent them from making quick decisions about his fate while giving him more time to study their operations and plan his next move. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Jake had intended. Fear and uncertainty were spreading through the ship's crew, and their confidence in their own technology was beginning to crack. Jake knew that confused and frightened enemies made critical mistakes, and he was patiently waiting for the right opportunity to exploit their growing weakness. After 2 weeks of psychological testing, Dr. Cora made a decision that would prove to be her biggest mistake. She moved Jake back to the main holding area with the other prisoners, believing that observing his interactions with different species would provide valuable research data. She installed hidden cameras and listening devices throughout the cell, thinking she could study how humans behaved in group situations. Jake appeared relieved to be back with the other captives, showing exactly the reaction that Dr. Cora expected from a social creature being reunited with companions. But internally, Jake was celebrating. The isolation cell had taught him valuable lessons about Vorthok technology and psychology, but he needed allies to execute any meaningful escape plan. Now he could begin the most important phase of his strategy. The lizard creature, Keth, approached Jake immediately when he entered the cell. The tall, reptilian being had obviously been thinking about Jake during his absence, and his yellow eyes showed intelligence that Jake had not fully appreciated before. Keth touched his own chest and made his name sound again, then pointed to Jake questioningly. Jake realized that Keth had been trying to communicate during their previous time together, but had given up when Jake seemed unresponsive. Jake pointed to himself and said his name clearly, then extended his hand in a universal gesture of friendship. Keth looked at the offered hand for several seconds before reaching out with his own clawed appendage. The handshake was awkward because of their different anatomy, but the meaning was clear to both of them. They were no longer just fellow prisoners, they were potential allies. The crystalline creature approached more cautiously, making soft musical sounds as it moved across the floor. Jake had been calling it the crystal spider in his mind, but he needed to learn its real identity if they were going to work together. The being stopped about 3 feet away and began creating a complex pattern of tones that seemed to contain multiple layers of meaning. Jake listened carefully, then tried to repeat some of the simpler sounds. To Jake's surprise, the crystal creature began to pulse with different colors while making its musical sounds. The colors seemed to correspond to different emotions or concepts, creating a form of communication that combined sound and light. Jake pointed to himself and said his name, then waited to see how the being would respond. After several minutes of musical tones, Jake heard something that sounded like Zara mixed in with the alien sounds. The tree-like being remained in its corner, but Jake could see that it was paying close attention to these interactions. The bar-covered creature swayed gently, as if moved by wind, and its leaf-covered branches rustled softly even in the still air of the cell. Jake approached slowly, making no sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening. When Jake got within arm's reach, the tree being suddenly extended one of its branch-like arms toward him. Jake felt a strange tingling sensation when the woody fingers touched his forehead, and suddenly his mind filled with images and concepts that were not his own. He saw vast forests on an alien world, understood complex mathematical equations, and felt the sensation of roots extending deep into soil. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but Jake realized he had just experienced direct mental communication. The tree being, which Jake decided to call Branch since he could not pronounce its real name, was some kind of living computer. It could process enormous amounts of information simultaneously and share knowledge through direct neural contact. More importantly, Branch had been observing everything that happened on the ship and had detailed knowledge of the Vorthok systems and procedures. Over the following days, Jake began teaching his new allies basic military concepts using a combination of gestures, simple drawings scratched into the floor, and the few Vorthok words he had learned. He showed them how to create distractions by having one person draw attention while others moved unseen. He demonstrated basic hand signals for silent communication and timing exercises for coordinated actions. Keth proved to be a quick learner with natural fighting instincts. The reptilian warrior understood concepts like flanking maneuvers and tactical positioning almost immediately. More valuable was his revelation that he could see in spectrums beyond human vision. Keth could detect heat patterns, electrical fields, and even chemical traces that were invisible to Jake. This made him perfect for surveillance and early warning systems. Zara's abilities were even more remarkable. During one of their planning sessions, Jake watched in amazement as the crystalline being approached the water dispenser in the wall, and somehow interfaced directly with its electronic systems. Zara's body began to glow with the same patterns of light that appeared on the dispenser's control panel, and suddenly water began flowing at different temperatures and pressures than the programmed settings allowed. Branch's contribution was perhaps the most crucial of all. Through their mental connection, Jake learned that the tree being had been mapping the entire ship's layout, monitoring guard schedules, and analyzing the Vorthok behavioral patterns. Branch could predict with remarkable accuracy when guards would change shifts, when Dr. Cora would visit, and when the ship's systems would be most vulnerable to sabotage. Jake began incorporating each alien's unique abilities into a comprehensive escape plan. Keth would serve as their scout and early warning system, using his enhanced vision to detect approaching guards or changes in the ship's status. Zara would handle all electronic systems, disabling security measures, and manipulating the ship's controls when the time came to act. Branch would coordinate timing and provide tactical analysis of their chances for success. The cell became a covert training ground where each species learned from the others. Jake taught them human concepts of teamwork, discipline, and strategic thinking. In return, he learned to work with abilities that no human military had ever imagined. Keth showed him how to detect enemy positions using heat signatures. Zara demonstrated techniques for interfacing with alien technology. Branch shared knowledge about the ship's vulnerabilities and the psychological weaknesses of their captors. Dr. Cora observed all of this through her hidden cameras, but she completely misunderstood what she was seeing. To her, the prisoners appeared to be engaging in simple social behaviors, grooming, play, and primitive communication. She had no concept of military organization or strategic planning, so she failed to recognize that her specimens were actually preparing for war. The alliance grew stronger each day, bound together by their shared determination to escape and their growing respect for each other's abilities. Jake had created something that the Vorthok had never encountered in all their years of specimen collection, a coordinated resistance movement that combined the best qualities of 4 different species into a single, focused weapon aimed at their captors' weaknesses. Jake waited in the corner of the cell, counting seconds in his head while watching the energy barrier flicker with its regular timing pattern. 3 weeks of careful observation had taught him that the guard shift change happened every 12 hours, with a 7-minute gap when the corridor outside their cell was completely empty. During those 7 minutes, only automated systems monitored the prisoners, and those systems had weaknesses that Zara had been studying for days. Branch stood motionless near the wall, but Jake could feel the mental energy radiating from the tree-like being as it processed thousands of calculations simultaneously. Guard movements, system cycles, power flow patterns, and emergency response protocols all flowed through Branch's consciousness like water through a forest. The living computer had identified the exact sequence of actions that would create maximum chaos with minimum risk of immediate capture. Keth crouched by the door, his yellow eyes scanning the corridor in multiple spectrums of light that humans could not see. His head tilted slightly as he detected the heat signatures of the day shift guards, moving away from their section toward the central command area. The night shift would not arrive for another 6 minutes, giving them the window of opportunity they had been waiting for. Zara moved silently toward the water dispenser, her crystalline body beginning to glow with soft patterns of blue and green light. Jake watched in fascination as the engineer's surface took on the same electrical patterns that flowed through the ship's control systems. Zara was not just interfacing with the dispenser, she was connecting herself to the entire network of electronic systems that controlled their prison. The energy barrier flickered off exactly on schedule, but this time it did not return. Zara had synchronized her intervention with the system's natural power cycle, making the failure appear to be a routine malfunction rather than deliberate sabotage. Jake stepped through the doorway first, followed immediately by Keth, whose enhanced senses would detect any threats that human eyes might miss. The corridor was empty just as Branch had predicted. Jake moved toward the first junction box with the practiced silence of a soldier who had spent years moving unseen through enemy territory. The improvised tools he had created during his time in isolation were hidden in his clothing strips of fabric for binding, sharp pieces of broken containers for cutting, and small metal fragments that could short-circuit delicate electronics. Keth positioned himself at the intersection where their corridor met the main passageway, using his heat vision to monitor guard positions throughout this section of the ship. His soft clicking sounds provided Jake with continuous updates on enemy movements. 2 guards were moving toward the engine compartment. 3 more were gathered in what appeared to be a break room, and the command deck showed the heat signatures of 5 Borthok, including Commander Vex. Jake reached the junction box and began working on its protective cover. His years of building shelters and repairing equipment in wilderness conditions had taught him how mechanical systems worked. Regardless of whether they were human or alien in origin, the Vorthok engineers had designed their ship for efficiency and reliability. But they had never considered the possibility that prisoners might have engineering knowledge of their own. The junction box opened easily once Jake found the right pressure points on its cover. Inside, he could see a complex arrangement of crystalline circuits and energy conduits that carried power to this entire section of the ship. Jake did not need to understand the technology completely. He only needed to identify which components would cause the most disruption when damaged. Zara's musical tones told him that she had successfully interfaced with the environmental control systems. The ship's air circulation, lighting, and temperature controls were now under her direction, rather than responding to the central computer. Jake felt a slight change in air pressure that indicated Zara was manipulating the ventilation systems to mask sounds and create confusion among the crew. Branch sent Jake a mental image showing the locations of critical power junctions throughout the ship. The tree being had been mapping these systems for weeks, identifying the most vulnerable points where small amounts of damage would cascade into major system failures. Jake memorized the locations and began moving toward the nearest target. The first power junction controlled lighting for 3 different levels of the ship. Jake used his improvised cutting tool to sever 2 key connections, plunging entire sections into darkness. Emergency lighting activated automatically, but the red glow was dim compared to normal illumination and created shadows that would help hide their movements. Alarms began sounding throughout the ship as the Vorthok crew realized that multiple systems were failing simultaneously. Jake could hear voices shouting in their clicking language, but the tone suggested confusion rather than organized response. The aliens had never dealt with coordinated sabotage before, and did not have established procedures for this type of emergency. Keth's warning clicks told Jake that guards were approaching from the main corridor. Jake pressed himself against the wall and waited as Vorthok ran past, heading toward the power junction he had just disabled. They carried portable scanning equipment, but no weapons, confirming Jake's assessment that these aliens were researchers rather than soldiers. The second junction box controlled the ship's internal communications system. Jake severed those connections with quick, precise cuts that would be difficult to repair without major equipment. Now, the Vorthok crew could not coordinate their response or call for help from other parts of the ship. Each group would have to deal with problems in their immediate area without knowing what was happening elsewhere. Zara had moved beyond the environmental controls and was now interfacing with the ship's navigation and propulsion systems. Jake felt the subtle vibration of the engine's changing rhythm as Zara manipulated their power output. She was not trying to disable the engines completely. That would trigger automatic safety systems that might be harder to override. Instead, She was creating irregular power fluctuations that would prevent the ship from functioning normally without immediately revealing the cause. Branch provided Jake with continuous updates on guard movements and system status throughout. The ship, the tree, being could process information from dozens of sources simultaneously, creating a real-time tactical picture that no human commander had ever possessed. Jake used this information to stay ahead of the Vorthok response teams, while moving toward the most critical targets. The third junction box controlled life support systems for the command deck, where Commander Vex and his senior officers were located. Jake did not disable these systems completely. Killing the crew was not his objective. Instead, he reduced air circulation and increased carbon dioxide levels just enough to make the aliens drowsy and slow their reaction times. Commander Vex's voice echoed through the ship's remaining communication systems, shouting orders in the Vorthok language. But his commands were having little effect because each section of the ship was dealing with different problems that required different solutions, and the crew had no experience working together during a crisis. The ship's emergency lighting cast long red shadows through the corridors as Jake moved silently toward the engineering section. Behind him, Keth followed with the fluid grace of a natural predator, while Zara's crystalline form reflected the dim light in scattered patterns that confused any watching eyes. Branch had remained in the main corridor to monitor Vorthok movements and relay information through their mental connection. Jake's bare feet made no sound on the metal floors. He approached the first group of crew members. 3 Vorthok engineers huddled around a damaged power junction, their pale faces illuminated by the glow from their handheld scanning devices. They spoke in worried whispers about system failures they could not explain or repair. Their body language showed complete confusion and growing panic. The engineers never heard Jake approaching from behind. His military training had taught him to move like a ghost when necessary, using shadows and sound masking to become invisible even in open spaces. The first engineer fell unconscious when Jake applied a precise chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain without causing permanent damage. The second engineer turned at the sound of his companion falling and found Keth's powerful claws wrapped around his throat. The third engineer tried to activate his wrist communicator to call for help, but Zara had already disabled the communication systems throughout this section. Jake bound all 3 aliens with fabric strips torn from their own uniforms, then dragged them into a storage room where they could not interfere with the continuing operation. Branch's mental voice guided Jake toward the next target. 4 guards had barricaded themselves in the ship's armory, trying to access weapons that could stop the escaped prisoners. But the armory's electronic locks were controlled by the same systems that Zara had infiltrated, and the guards found themselves trapped inside their own defensive position. Jake studied the armory door through the small window while formulating his assault plan. The guards inside were armed with energy weapons, but they were designed for stunning specimens rather than killing armed enemies. More importantly, the Vorthok had positioned themselves facing the door, expecting any attack to come from the corridor. They had not considered that their enemies might have other options. Zara interfaced with the armory's environmental controls and began reducing the oxygen level inside the room. The guards noticed the change within minutes as their breathing became labored and their thinking grew cloudy. When Jake finally opened the door, using Zara's electronic override, the 4 Vorthok were barely conscious and offered no resistance to capture. The systematic hunting continued through every section of the ship. Jake divided his team to cover more ground while maintaining communication through Branch's mental network. Keth's enhanced senses made him perfect for tracking down crew members who tried to hide in storage areas or maintenance shafts. His heat vision could detect body signatures through walls and floors, eliminating any possibility of successful concealment. 2 medical technicians had locked themselves in the ship's sickbay, believing that the thick walls and emergency ceiling would protect them. They activated a distress beacon that should have alerted other Vorthok vessels in the area, But Zara had corrupted the signal to broadcast random noise instead of a coherent message for help. Jake approached the sick bay using ventilation shafts that Keth had identified with his thermal scanning. The Vorthok had not considered that their prisoners might have knowledge of military infiltration techniques. Jake dropped into the room through a ceiling panel and disabled both technicians before they realized their security had been breached. Dr. Cora was found in her private laboratory, desperately trying to send research data to the Vorthok homeworld before the ship was completely compromised. She had isolated herself behind multiple security barriers and thought she was safe from the primitive specimens who had escaped their cells. Her first indication that this assumption was wrong came when Zara began manifesting inside the laboratories. Computer systems. The crystalline engineer appeared as patterns of light within Dr. Cora's equipment, systematically deleting files and corrupting databases with the efficiency of a living computer virus. Dr. Cora watched in horror as years of research vanished from her screens, replaced by alien symbols that seemed to mock her scientific achievements. When Jake entered the laboratory through a maintenance shaft that Dr. Cora had not even known existed, she was sitting motionless at her workstation with tears running down her pale face. The scientist who had treated him like a laboratory animal now stared at him with the same helpless fear that her specimens had shown during countless experiments. Commander Vex made his final stand on the ship's bridge, surrounded by his remaining officers and what they believed were impenetrable security systems. The bridge was designed to be the most secure location on the vessel, with independent power supplies and communication equipment that should have allowed them to maintain control, even during major emergencies. Branch had been studying the bridge defenses for weeks, identifying weaknesses that the Vorthok engineers had never considered. The security systems were designed to keep intruders out, but they were vulnerable to attack from within the ship's own network. When Zara began her electronic assault on the bridge systems, the defenders found themselves trapped inside their command center with no way to call for help or control their own ship. Jake's final approach to the bridge was a masterpiece of tactical planning. Keth created a distraction by appearing in the main corridor, drawing the attention of the bridge guards toward the primary entrance. Meanwhile, Jake entered through the emergency escape hatch that was designed to help the crew abandon ship during disasters, not to prevent enemies from entering. Commander Vex turned around to find the human prisoner standing behind his command chair, holding an improvised weapon against his throat. The other bridge officers reached for their emergency controls, but Zara had already disabled every system that might threaten the escaped prisoners or restore Vorthok control over their vessel. "Your ship is now under new management," Jake said, quietly, using the Vorthok language he had learned during his captivity. "You are all prisoners until we reach our destinations." Commander Vex looked around his bridge at the humans and aliens who had systematically dismantled his advanced spacecraft, using nothing but intelligence, cooperation, and skills that his people had dismissed as primitive. For the first time in his career, the Vorthok commander understood that superior technology meant nothing when faced with superior strategy and determination. The hunt was over, and the hunters had become the hunted. Jake stood on the bridge of the captured Vorthok vessel, studying the alien control systems with the same careful attention he had once given to reading animal tracks in the wilderness. The ship's navigation computer displayed a 3D map of local space, showing the locations of dozens of star systems within range of their current position. Each point of light represented worlds that the Vorthok had visited during their specimen collection missions. Branch had connected directly to the ship's main computer, downloading centuries of navigation data and flight procedures into his vast memory. The tree-like Bane could process this information faster than any Vorthok crew member, but translating alien concepts into actions that Jake could understand required patience and careful communication. Through their mental link, Branch showed Jake how the ship's controls responded to touch and thought patterns. The Vorthok piloted their vessels through a combination of physical controls and mental interfaces that read the operators' intentions directly from their brain activity. Jake found that his military training and operating complex equipment allowed him to adapt to this system more quickly than Branch had expected. Zara had taken control of the ship's internal systems, ensuring that life support, artificial gravity, and other essential functions continued operating normally. Her crystalline form now pulsed with the same rhythms as the ship's computers, making her an extension of the vessel itself. She could monitor every system simultaneously and make adjustments faster than any organic crew member. The first stop on their liberation tours was Keth's homeworld, a dry planet covered in red deserts and rocky mountains. As they approached the world's orbital space, Jake was amazed to see hundreds of primitive spacecraft rising to meet them. Keth's people were warriors who had developed space travel through conquest and determination rather than advanced science. Keth stood beside Jake on the bridge as they established communication with his planet's defense forces. The reptilian warrior spoke in his native language, explaining what had happened during his captivity and introducing his rescuers as honored allies. Jake watched through the view screen as massive warships surrounded the Vorthok vessel, their crews ready for battle if this turned out to be another specimen collection mission. When Keth transported down to his planet's surface, he carried with him detailed information about Vorthok technology and methods that his people could use to defend themselves against future attacks. Jake had insisted that all the liberated prisoners should take this knowledge home with them, turning the Vorthok's own research against them by sharing it with their former victims. The second destination was Zara's crystalline world, a place of incredible beauty where living cities grew from mineral formations that sang in the solar wind. Zara's people communicated through harmonic frequencies that created complex music when many individuals spoke together. As they approached the planet, Jake could hear their welcoming songs through the ship's communication systems. Zara had learned much about electronic warfare during her time aboard the Vorthok vessel. She downloaded copies of all the ship's technical specifications and defensive capabilities before departing, ensuring that her people would be able to detect and disable Vorthok technology if they ever encountered it again. Her crystalline form flickered with patterns of light that Jake had learned meant satisfaction and gratitude. Branch's world was unlike anything Jake had imagined. The entire planet was covered in a single vast forest where individual trees were connected through root networks that functioned as a planetary consciousness. When Branch returned home, Jake realized that his friend was not just one being, but part of a collective intelligence that spanned continents. The forest mind welcomed Jake with warmth that he could feel even without the mental connection that Branch had shared with him. Through rustling leaves and shifting patterns of growth, the planetary intelligence expressed gratitude for Jake's leadership and protection of their representative. They promised that Branch's experiences would be shared with every tree on the planet, ensuring that knowledge of the Vorthok threat would never be forgotten. With his allies safely returned to their homes, Jake turned his attention to the crew members who remained locked in their own holding cells. Commander Vex and Dr. Cora had spent weeks experiencing the same helplessness and uncertainty that their specimens had endured for years. The transformation in their behavior was remarkable. The arrogant scientists had become frightened prisoners who jumped at every sound. Jake visited Commander Vex in the converted laboratory that now served as the aliens' prison cell. The Vorthok leader sat on the floor in the same position that Jake had once occupied, surrounded by white walls that offered no comfort or hope of escape. When Jake entered, Commander Vex looked up with eyes that showed a mixture of fear and genuine curiosity. "I have been thinking about what you did," Commander Vex said in his carefully practiced English. "Your species shows capabilities that our research never detected. How did we fail to understand what humans could do?" Jake sat down across from his former captor, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had served him throughout his captivity. You studied us like animals in a zoo, instead of trying to understand us as equals. That was your first mistake. But why did you not kill us when you had the opportunity? Commander Vex asked. Your military training surely included methods for eliminating enemies permanently. Jake considered the question carefully before answering. Because humans understand the difference between justice and revenge. You captured us illegally and treated us badly, but that does not give us the right to murder you in return. We believe in something called proportional response. The punishment should fit the crime. This concept is foreign to us, Commander Vex admitted. Most species we have encountered either submit completely or fight until they are destroyed. Humans seem to follow different rules. We do, Jake agreed. But you should understand something clearly. This ship contains complete records of your research activities and the locations of all the worlds you have attacked. I am transmitting this information to every spacefaring civilization we can contact. Your people will face justice for what they have done. Commander Vex nodded slowly, understanding that the age of unopposed Vorthok expansion was ending. What will happen to us? You will be returned to your own people to face whatever consequences your society deems appropriate, Jake replied. But first, we are destroying every piece of research data on this ship and releasing all the remaining specimens you collected from other worlds. The journey back to Earth took several months, during which Jake learned to operate the Vorthok vessel with increasing skill. He established contact with human space agencies and governments, preparing them for humanity's first official contact with alien civilizations. The captured ship would provide Earth with technology advances that might have taken centuries to develop independently. But when government officials offered Jake positions as an ambassador, military advisor, or director of alien relations, he politely declined them all. Jake had spent enough time away from the wilderness that had shaped his character and abilities. The Montana forests were calling him home. On a crisp autumn evening, Jake built a campfire in the same clearing where his adventure had begun. The Vorthok ship was now in the hands of human scientists and military personnel, who would use its technology to protect Earth from future threats. Other species across the galaxy had been warned about the specimen collectors and armed with knowledge to defend themselves. Jake settled back against a fallen log and watched sparks rise toward stars that no longer seemed distant and mysterious. Somewhere among those points of light, the Vorthok were learning that the universe contained species they could not simply capture and study like laboratory animals. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy not as victims, but as protectors of the weak and enemies of those who would exploit others. The wilderness was quiet around Jake's fire, filled with the familiar sounds of creatures who belonged in this place. But now the entire galaxy knew that even the most peaceful humans could become dangerous when their freedom or the freedom of others was threatened. Jake had returned home, but he had also ensured that humanity would never again face the unknown alone and unprepared.